The air in Alabama during the summer of 2017 hung heavy and still, clinging oppressively within the walls of Redstone Correctional Facility. Gray concrete stained by the relentless sun and infrequent, hard rains seemed to absorb the stifling heat only to radiate it back into the enclosed yards and echoing corridors. The sounds formed a dreary, constant symphony, the distant metallic clang of steel doors slamming shut, the rhythmic scuff of standard-issue shoes on worn linoleum floors, the disembodied crackle of radios carried by patrolling officers, and the low, persistent murmur of hundreds of confined lives weaving together in a tapestry of boredom and quiet desperation. For Tamara Jones, inmate number 81542, each day bled seamlessly into the next with a suffocating sameness that threatened to extinguish any flicker of hope. The jarring blare of the morning alarm shattered the restless darkness, followed by the impersonal count, the bland, utilitarian breakfast served on metal trays. Then came the long hours assigned to her current duty, sorting endless piles of incoming and outgoing mail in a stuffy, windowless room under the watchful eyes of a supervising officer. Another count punctuated the afternoon, dinner, equally uninspired, lockdown, sealing her into her small cell. The restless dark returned, promising little respite before the cycle began anew. It was a routine meticulously designed to grind down the spirit, to reduce individuals to numbers and compliant bodies. She was serving 5 years for a robbery that had gone terribly wrong, a desperate mistake born of circumstances she rarely allowed herself to dwell on, the memories too sharp, too painful. Freedom felt like a hazy, abstract concept, a distant shore too far off to truly imagine reaching. Barely into her 20s, Tamara possessed a resilience that hadn't yet been entirely extinguished by the drab uniformity and constant low-level tension of prison life. Her eyes, though often shadowed with fatigue from lack of restful sleep and the sheer weight of her confinement, held a watchful intelligence. She had learned quickly the cardinal rules of survival within these imposing walls. Keep your head down, avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Trust no one completely, as alliances were fleeting and often self-serving. Observe everything, noticing the subtle shifts in power dynamics, the moods of the guards, the undercurrents of tension among the inmates. She moved through her days with a quiet determination, her face usually a carefully maintained mask of neutrality. She performed her assigned duties efficiently, steered clear of unnecessary conflicts, and found precious solace in the tattered paperbacks occasionally available from the prison library cart, escaping into other worlds for brief, stolen hours. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed, hoarding her thoughts and emotions like precious contraband in an environment where vulnerability was a dangerous liability. Amidst the shifting roster of correctional officers, most blurring into a collective image of khaki uniforms and stern, impassive expressions, one man gradually began to stand out in Tamara's perception. Officer David Miller. He wasn't overtly kinder or more lenient than the others. The rigid system didn't allow for much deviation from protocol. Yet there was something different in his bearing, a subtle lack of the hardened cynicism that seemed etched onto the faces of so many of his colleagues who had walked these same corridors for years. Sometimes during the monotonous head counts where inmates stood silently against their cell doors, or during his slow patrols down the cell block, Tamara caught a flicker of something else in his gaze as it swept over the inmates. Weariness, perhaps, or a hint of contemplation that seemed to go beyond the immediate demands of his job. He carried himself with a certain quiet authority, but without the aggressive edge some officers cultivated, seemingly as a defense mechanism or a projection of power. David Miller had walked these same corridors at Redstone for 7 long years. The initial sense of purpose, the perhaps naive belief that he could make a difference, had long since eroded under the immense weight of bureaucracy, the constant simmering tension, and the daily exposure to the bleak, often brutal realities of incarceration. He felt the dehumanizing effect of the job, not just on the inmates crammed into overcrowded cells, but acutely on himself. The routine was soul-crushing, the environment inherently hostile. He saw the endless cycles of despair, the sudden, terrifying flashes of violence, the small kindnesses brutally extinguished by the harsh rules or the predatory nature of prison life. He felt increasingly like a cog in a machine he no longer fully believed in, trapped in his own way by the steady paycheck, the benefits, and the distinct lack of appealing alternatives in the struggling local economy outside the prison walls. He went through the motions, maintained the required professional distance, but a deep-seated dissatisfaction gnawed at him constantly, a quiet desperation mirroring that of the inmates he guarded. Their awareness of each other grew incrementally, subtly, almost imperceptibly to an outside observer. An accidental meeting of eyes held a fraction of a second too long during the morning count. A brief, almost imperceptible pause by Officer Miller near Tamara's workstation in the mail sorting room, his gaze sweeping over the area with professional thoroughness, yet somehow lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. These were minuscule events, easily dismissed in the outside world, but in the hyper-aware, stimulus-deprived environment of Redstone, they resonated with unexpected significance. Tamara started noticing the specific cadence of his footsteps approaching her cell block, the way he held his shoulders, differentiating him from the anonymous presence of other guards. David, in turn, found his eyes drawn to her during mealtimes in the noisy cafeteria, noting her quiet self-containment amidst the surrounding chaos, the way she seemed to retreat into herself, creating a small pocket of calm. Brief, necessary exchanges, a request for more sorting bins, and instruction during lockdown procedures began to feel charged with an unspoken meaning that lingered after the words faded. A standard command like "Jones, step forward" during a count might be delivered by him with a tone slightly less harsh than usual. A dropped bundle of letters retrieved without an immediate, sharp reprimand. These were tiny deviations from the rigid norm, almost non-existent, yet they built a fragile, invisible thread between them, stretching across the chasm of their mandated roles. It was a dangerous awareness, a spark flickering tentatively in the suffocating atmosphere. The power imbalance was immense, absolute. The rules were explicit. Interaction beyond the strictly professional was forbidden, the consequences severe for both the guard and the inmate. Yet the pull persisted, defying logic and regulation. For David, Tamara represented something other than just another inmate identification number on a roster. Perhaps it was her youth, or the guarded intelligence that flickered in her eyes hinting at a life, a potential, beyond her current grim circumstances. She broke the monotony, an anomaly in the gray landscape of his daily grind. Observing her, interacting with her even minimally, stirred something dormant within him, a flicker of feeling beyond duty and the heavy weight of disillusionment. For Tamara, David's brief moments of perceived humanity were like finding a rare wildflower pushing stubbornly through cracked pavement. The possibility, however faint, that one of the authority figures who held so much power over her life saw her as more than her crime, more than inmate 81542, even fleetingly, was a potent, dangerous allure. The risk was immense, a terrifying tightrope walk over a chasm of institutional retribution and social ruin. But the silent understanding, the shared glances, the dangerous energy crackling almost palpably between them in the sterile prison air became an undeniable force, pulling them closer despite the inherent, ever-present perils. The temptation to acknowledge the connection, to step further across the forbidden line, grew stronger with each passing day. Each shared look, each brief, charged interaction. The unspoken tension between them eventually sought release, escalating from charged glances held across crowded rooms to whispered words exchanged in fleeting moments when the ever-watchful eyes of the prison system seemed to blink. A note, folded impossibly small, passed discreetly from his hand to hers during the brief exchange of mailbags, the transfer masked by the mundane routine. A specific time suggested in a low murmur during a supposedly routine cell inspection, the words barely audible above the ambient noise of the block. A location chosen for its relative obscurity, a place less frequented by patrols, less monitored by the aging surveillance cameras. Their first true rendezvous was a heart-pounding affair, conducted in the cramped, dimly lit confines of a utility closet adjacent to the kitchen storage area. The air hung thick with the smell of industrial cleaning chemicals and the faint, damp scent of concrete. For precious, stolen minutes, shielded from view, the rigid roles of guard and inmate dissolved, replaced by the raw, undeniable connection between a man and a woman starved for genuine human contact, however fraught with peril. Fear was a palpable third presence in the small space, mingling with the intoxicating rush of transgression, the thrill of defying the absolute rules that govern their separate existences. His uniform felt stiff and alien against her standard-issue cotton. Her proximity, so forbidden, sent jolts through his system. These clandestine meetings became their fragile, secret reality. They learned the prison's rhythms with the focused intensity of survivalists, mapping unknown territory. They discovered the blind spots in the surveillance network, the predictable patterns of other officers' patrols, the brief windows of opportunity during shift changes or meal times when a short absence might go unnoticed. A disused storage room on a lower level, filled with obsolete kitchen equipment and smelling faintly of dust, decay, and forgotten things, became another sanctuary. Sometimes it was the shadowy corner behind the large, humming industrial freezers in the food storage area, accessible only during certain hours. Each encounter was a gamble played against overwhelming odds, a nerve-wracking tightrope walk without a safety net. The risk was immense, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of their stolen intimacy. For David, discovery meant immediate dismissal and disgrace, the loss of his pension, public humiliation, and potentially severe legal trouble for abusing his position of authority. For Tamara, the consequences were equally dire: harsh disciplinary action, solitary confinement, loss of privileges earned through careful behavior, possibly additional time added to her already lengthy sentence, and the dangerous enmity of other guards and potentially other inmates if word got out about her relationship with an officer. They existed in a bubble of shared secrecy, fueled by a potent cocktail of desperate desire, loneliness, and adrenaline. The inherent danger, the constant threat of exposure, seemed only to heighten the intensity of their connection. Every brief touch exchanged in the shadows felt electric, charged with the forbidden nature of their bond. Every quiet conversation, whispered amidst the institutional hum of fluorescent lights and distant clanging doors, felt profound, imbued with a significance born of scarcity and risk. They clung to these moments, brief respites from the crushing weight of their respective confinements, his of disillusionment and routine, hers of physical incarceration and lost hope. It was an escape, a temporary suspension of the harsh rules that governed their lives within Redstone's walls. In those stolen minutes, hidden away from the prying eyes of the institution, they offered each other an illusion of normalcy, a fleeting glimpse of the tenderness and connection that the prison system was designed to eradicate. David began taking small, calculated risks, smuggling in minor tokens for Tamara, gestures that felt disproportionately significant in the barren landscape of prison life. An extra piece of fruit, perhaps an apple or an orange saved from his own lunch, slipped discreetly into her hand during a moment of low surveillance, felt like a feast. A pen that wrote smoothly, replacing the standard, often faulty prison issue. A page torn carefully from a recent newspaper he'd read, offering news and stories from the outside world she was cut off from, became a treasured link to the life she yearned for. These small gestures were fraught with peril for him. Contraband, however minor, was still a serious offense, but served as tangible proof of his regard, affirmations of the secret world they were painstakingly building together against the odds. Tamara, in return, offered him something less tangible, but perhaps more valuable in his state of weary cynicism. Her undivided attention, a listening ear free from the judgment or demands he faced elsewhere in his life, both inside and outside the prison walls. In her presence, away from the rigid hierarchy and the constant need for vigilance and professional detachment, David felt less like a uniformed automaton, a mere functionary of the state, and more like a man. She saw past the badge, acknowledging the person beneath the uniform, and that silent recognition, that acceptance, was a powerful balm to his jaded spirit, something he hadn't realized he desperately needed until he found it in the most unlikely of places. Weeks bled into a month, then two. Their illicit routine became almost comfortable, the initial raw terror softening into a constant, manageable anxiety. They grew bolder, perhaps inevitably careless, lulled by their repeated success in evading detection. The frequency of their meetings increased slightly, the duration sometimes stretching by precious, risky minutes. The bond between them deepened, evolving beyond pure physical attraction and the thrill of the forbidden into a complex emotional dependency. In the bleak, isolating expanse of Redstone Correctional Facility, they had become each other's anchor, a secret source of warmth and humanity in an environment designed to stifle both. It was around this time, deep into the humid Alabama summer, that David Miller started to feel unwell. At first, it was just a pervasive fatigue, a weariness that settled deep in his bones and wasn't alleviated by sleep, no matter how long he lay in his lonely apartment bed off shift. He attributed it to the long hours walking the concrete floors of Redstone, the inherent stress of the job, the relentless, sapping heat that seemed to drain the energy from everyone. He pushed through it, relying on extra cups of strong, bitter coffee from the staff room and sheer willpower to get through his shifts. Then came the night sweats. He would wake up in the pre-dawn hours, his t-shirt damp, the sheets clinging uncomfortably to his skin, even when the cheap air conditioner in his apartment rattled diligently against the oppressive night air. He dismissed it as a reaction to the persistent summer heat, or perhaps a lingering flu bug picked up within the closed environment of the prison, where germs circulated freely. A persistent low-grade fever began to accompany the fatigue and sweats, making him feel slightly off-kilter, his head fuzzy, his concentration wavering at times. He popped over-the-counter pain relievers and told himself it was just a summer cold he couldn't quite shake, maybe exacerbated by the stress of his secret relationship and the constant low-level fear of discovery. Working in a closed environment like a prison, exposure to common illnesses was constant. He doubled down on his work, trying to ignore the subtle, persistent signals his body was sending, attributing the malaise to the accumulated toll of his demanding job and the secret strain of navigating his forbidden affair with Tamara. The gnawing feeling that something might be truly wrong remained, but he pushed it firmly to the periphery of his consciousness, overshadowed by the more immediate risks and the consuming nature of their secret connection. Yet the symptoms lingered, a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface of his daily life, refusing to fully disappear. The persistent fatigue deepened, clinging to David like a shroud he couldn't shake off. The night sweats became more frequent, more drenching, leaving him feeling clammy and drained each morning before his shift even began. The low fever remained a constant, unwelcome companion, sometimes spiking slightly higher in the evenings. Simple tasks at work, ones he used to perform automatically, began to feel monumental. His usual stamina was replaced by an unnerving weakness that worried him. He tried desperately to rationalize it away. Maybe it was mononucleosis. Maybe Lyme disease from a forgotten tick bite during a rare weekend fishing trip months ago. Anything but the nameless dread that had begun to coil tightly in his gut. Finally, unable to ignore the accumulating, undeniable symptoms any longer, he scheduled an appointment with a doctor. He deliberately chose a clinic in a town nearly 40 miles away from Redstone, seeking anonymity far from colleagues or anyone who might recognize him and connect him back to the prison. The clinic waiting room was sterile and impersonal, filled with the quiet shuffling of papers, the low murmur of daytime television ignored by anxious patients, and the smell of antiseptic. David sat rigidly, flipping through a worn magazine without registering the words, acutely aware of every cough and sniffle around him, his own anxiety a palpable knot in his stomach. When his name was finally called, he followed the nurse down a brightly lit corridor, his heart pounding with a confusing mixture of hope for a simple, treatable explanation and a profound fear of the unknown. The doctor, a brisk, professional man whose demeanor offered neither excessive warmth nor coldness, listened patiently as David described his symptoms. The fatigue, the sweats, the fever, carefully omitting any details about his personal life or occupation that weren't strictly necessary. Blood was drawn, several vials filled with a dark crimson liquid that seemed suddenly ominous, carrying the potential for life-altering news. The doctor mentioned running a standard panel of tests, including checks for various infections, his tone remaining noncommittal, offering no premature diagnoses or reassurances. David left the clinic feeling strangely hollow, the brief medical encounter offering no immediate answers, only the promise of a phone call in a few days once the lab results were back. The waiting period was agonizing. Every waking moment was tinged with a sharp, biting anxiety. Sleep offered little respite, often interrupted by drenching sweats or restless tossing and turning. At work, he went through the motions robotically, his mind elsewhere, the familiar routines and gray walls of Redstone feeling distant and unreal. He meticulously reviewed his recent past, searching desperately for logical, benign explanations for his illness, trying to convince himself it was something manageable, temporary. He clung to the idea of a persistent virus, a bad reaction to something he ate, anything other than the darker possibilities that flickered menacingly at the edges of his thoughts. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while David was off duty, staring blankly at the television screen in his small, sparsely furnished apartment. The caller ID showed the clinic's number, and his stomach clenched violently. He answered, his voice catching slightly. The doctor's tone was calm, professional, yet devastatingly direct. There were no ambiguities, no softened edges. The tests had come back. David was HIV positive. The three letters hung in the air, amplified in the sudden silence of the room, severing his life cleanly into before and after. The room seemed to spin slightly, the pattern on the cheap rug blurring beneath his feet. He heard the doctor continue talking, mentioning next steps, treatment options, counseling resources, the importance of follow-up care, but the words blurred into an incomprehensible drone. Shock rendered him mute, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He managed a choked affirmative when asked if he understood, then ended the call, sinking heavily onto the edge of his worn couch. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. The initial shock slowly receded, replaced by a wave of icy terror that spread through his veins, paralyzing him. His future, once a vague landscape of undefined possibilities, now seemed like a narrow, shadowed path, leading inexorably toward illness, stigma, and uncertainty. Denial surged briefly. A mistake, a lab error, it had to be. But the doctor's clinical certainty echoed relentlessly in his mind. Then came the desperate, frantic question, how? He hadn't been reckless, not by his own standards. He replayed the past year, then two, scrutinizing every encounter, every potential risk. His social life outside of work had been minimal, his previous relationships sparse and distant long before he started working at Redstone. The timeline contracted violently, focusing with horrifying clarity on the last few months, on the stolen moments in dimly lit storage rooms and shadowy corners of the prison. Tamara. Her name struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was the only one. There was no other explanation in his panicked state. Suddenly, fragments of past conversations, previously insignificant remarks she'd made about feeling unwell before her incarceration, about bouts of fatigue or unexplained fevers she'd dismissed as minor ailments, resurfaced in his memory, twisted instantly into damning evidence by his panicked, accusatory mind. Had she known? The thought solidified instantly, hardening into absolute certainty within his reeling consciousness. She must have known. A cold, venomous rage began to bloom in the pit of his stomach, rapidly eclipsing the fear and the nascent grief. He felt profoundly, utterly betrayed. The tenderness he had felt for her, the fragile connection they had painstakingly built in secret, curdled instantly into bitter resentment and a burning, all-consuming sense of injustice. He saw her now not as a partner in a forbidden, mutually risky affair, but as a calculating deceiver who had knowingly, perhaps maliciously, infected him. Maybe as a twisted form of revenge against the system he represented, or simply out of careless disregard for his life, his future. The transformation was swift and total. The man who had smuggled oranges and listened with quiet sympathy ceased to exist, replaced by someone consumed by fury and a desperate, overwhelming need for retribution. The change in David Miller became noticeable to his colleagues at Redstone. His usual quiet composure evaporated, replaced by a short temper and sullen withdrawal. He barked orders where a simple instruction would have sufficed, responded curtly to routine questions, and his interactions with the inmate population became uniformly harsh, devoid of any previous hint of weary empathy. The casual camaraderie of the staff break room felt suffocating. He found himself avoiding unnecessary conversation, his mind consumed by the venomous rage that festered inside him. The shift was most pronounced, chillingly so, in his dealings with Tamara. The furtive glances, once filled with a dangerous warmth and shared secrets, now held a palpable hostility. When his patrol route took him past her assigned workstation, currently sorting donated books in the underfunded prison library, his eyes would lock onto her with an accusatory glare that made her flinch and look away, bewildered and frightened by the sudden, inexplicable animosity. He deliberately altered his path sometimes just to pass her, deriving a perverse satisfaction from the fear he saw bloom in her eyes. One afternoon, the simmering tension boiled over. He saw her bent over a cart piled high with worn paperbacks, meticulously organizing them. He strode towards her, his steps heavy and deliberate on the worn floor. Tamara looked up as he approached, perhaps expecting some explanation for his recent coldness, maybe even hoping for a return to their secret understanding. But the expression she saw etched onto his face stopped her cold. It wasn't the guarded affection she had known, nor the professional indifference she was used to from other guards. It was something raw, distorted by an anger so profound it seemed almost alien on his features. Confusion clouded her face, quickly followed by a dawning, visceral unease. She instinctively took a small step back, bumping slightly against the metal book cart behind her. He didn't speak. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary for the accusation burning within him, the certainty of her betrayal, a white-hot brand on his soul. Reaching out abruptly, he seized her upper arm, his grip far tighter than necessary, bruisingly strong. His fingers dug into her flesh through the thin fabric of her standard-issue uniform. It wasn't a touch meant to connect, but to restrain, to punish. He leaned in slightly, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes, once the source of a forbidden warmth that had sustained her, now blazed with a cold, accusatory fire. They held no trace of their shared past, only condemnation and a terrifying intensity that stripped the air from her lungs. A small gasp escaped Tamara's lips. Her eyes widened in shock and fear, searching his face for some explanation, some sign of the man she thought she knew. Her mouth opened slightly as if to ask a question, but no sound came out. Her expression shifted rapidly. Bewilderment, hurt, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over her features as she registered the depth of his hostility. She tried instinctively to pull her arm away, a small, futile gesture against his superior strength. Her body tensed, bracing for something unknown but undeniably threatening. Perhaps she didn't understand the specific accusation simmering behind his glare. Maybe the possibility of her own health status hadn't fully registered, or was something she feared confronting herself. Or perhaps the sheer unexpectedness and violence of his approach simply paralyzed her. But David saw none of that nuance. Blinded by his own pain and the consuming certainty of her betrayal, he interpreted her fear as guilt, her confusion as evasion, her shocked silence as an admission. Every flicker of emotion across her face seemed only to confirm his darkest suspicions. He felt a perverse satisfaction in her terror, a twisted justification for the rage that consumed him. The memory of the doctor's voice on the phone, the chilling finality of the diagnosis, the bleak landscape of his compromised future, it all coalesced into this single, hateful moment directed entirely at the woman trembling in his grasp. She was the source, the cause, the embodiment of his shattered life. With a guttural sound low in his throat, fueled by a surge of revulsion and searing pain, he shoved her violently away from him. The force of the push sent her stumbling backward, her hip colliding hard with the corner of the metal cart. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, more from shock and fear than physical pain, catching herself just before falling onto the floor amidst the scattered books. He didn't wait to see her reaction. Turning sharply on his heel, his face still a mask of controlled fury, he strode out of the library without a backward glance, leaving Tamara alone amidst the silent shelves and the tangible echo of his rage. This confrontation solidified his resolve. The evenings in his sterile apartment became a blur of cheap whiskey. He drank to numb the fear that lay beneath the anger, to silence the raging thoughts that circled endlessly in his mind. But the alcohol only sharpened the edges of his fury, fueling the dark resentment that festered inside him. Staring into the amber liquid, the image of Tamara's face would swim before him. No longer the object of forbidden affection, but the embodiment of his ruined future, the architect of his potential suffering. The desire for vengeance began to coalesce, taking shape in the alcohol-fueled darkness, hardening into a cold, calculated plan. He needed a place, somewhere isolated, forgotten, where sounds wouldn't carry and discovery was unlikely. His mind sifted through his intimate knowledge of Redstone's layout. The abandoned hospital wing on the second floor of the old administration block was perfect. It hadn't been used for years, relegated to storing broken furniture and outdated medical equipment, thick layers of dust coating everything. It was isolated, thick-walled, far from the main thoroughfares of the prison, and notoriously overlooked during routine checks unless there was a specific, documented reason to venture there. Access was restricted, requiring specific keys, but not impossible for an officer with his level of clearance and knowledge of the building's less traveled routes. The challenge was luring Tamara there without raising suspicion, especially after their violent encounter in the library. He couldn't approach her directly now. Her fear would be too great, her suspicion immediate. He used an intermediary, another inmate known for passing messages discreetly for a small price, usually a couple of cigarettes or a desired commissary item, someone unlikely to ask questions or remember specifics later. The message David carefully crafted was delivered on a folded scrap of paper. It hinted at an urgent need to talk, suggesting remorse for his outburst, perhaps even implying a desperate apology. It proposed a final secret meeting to clear the air, to explain things, delivered with a faint note of desperation that David hoped would prey on any lingering confusion, hurt, or perhaps even a foolish shred of hope Tamara might still harbor regarding their shattered connection. The designated time was deep into the night shift, during a period when staff presence was minimal in that rarely patrolled section of the prison. As the appointed hour approached, David detached himself from his regular patrol route, murmuring a fabricated excuse about checking a reported electrical issue near the old wing access point into his radio, knowing the log would show a plausible reason for his presence in the area. He moved swiftly through the quieter service corridors, his keys jingling softly against his thigh, the sound unnervingly loud in the heavy stillness of the sleeping prison. He unlocked the heavy steel door leading to the stairwell of the old block, slipping through and securing it quietly behind him. The air grew cooler here, damper, thick with the scent of mildew, stale disinfectant, and decay. He navigated the dusty, dimly lit corridor on the second floor, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, finally reaching the double doors of the abandoned hospital wing. He unlocked one side and stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, cloaked in the deep shadows just beyond the entrance, waiting. The cavernous space was filled with the hulking, silent shapes of defunct examination tables, overturned gurneys, and cabinets spilling forgotten files, all casting long, distorted shadows in the faint emergency lighting that filtered in from the corridor outside. Minutes later, stretched taut by anticipation and the cold resolve chilling his veins, he heard hesitant footsteps approaching down the passage. Tamara appeared at the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. She paused, peering uncertainly into the gloomy space, perhaps looking for him, her posture radiating apprehension and visible fear. Maybe she half expected an apology, a desperate plea for understanding, or maybe she feared another violent outburst. Whatever fragile hope or lingering fear brought her there, it was extinguished the moment she stepped fully inside, and David emerged silently from the shadows, his face unreadable in the dimness, but his intention terrifyingly clear in the cold set of his eyes. There was no preamble, no final accusation, no words spoken. The rage he had been carefully nursing, refining into a sharp point of purpose, exploded. He moved on her before she could truly react, before any plea or cry could fully form on her lips. He grabbed her hard, one hand clamping forcefully over her mouth, muffling the sound she tried to make. The sheer terror in her eyes was stark in the dim light, as she instantly realized the lethal intent behind his sudden, silent actions. She struggled instinctively, desperately, her body fueled by adrenaline and the primal urge to survive. But her strength, diminished by prison life and caught utterly by surprise, was no match for his size, his fury, and his cold determination. The struggle was brief, brutal, and horribly one-sided, confined to the small, dusty space between silent, forgotten machines of healing now repurposed for violence. He acted with a detached efficiency now, the earlier blinding rage channeled into grim, focused purpose. He overpowered her quickly, forcing her backwards, silencing her struggles against his chest, his actions driven by the singular, overriding need to erase the source of his pain, his perceived betrayal, the woman he blamed for destroying his life. He wrapped his hands around her throat, squeezing with methodical force. When it was over, an unnatural, profound silence descended upon the abandoned hospital wing, broken only by David's own ragged breathing, loud in the stillness. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He stared down at Tamara's still form on the dusty floor for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a hollow ache in the first icy tendrils of real paralyzing fear. But there was no time for remorse or panic. His training, his knowledge of procedure, and a powerful instinct for self-preservation took over immediately. He began methodically erasing his presence, staging the scene. He carefully repositioned her body near a rusted metal cabinet, attempting to make it look like a desperate act of self-harm, perhaps an overdose procured or hoarded. From his pocket, he produced several empty, dated pill bottles, potent sedatives he had acquired from the prison infirmary disposal bin earlier, anticipating this need. He scattered them near her hand and on the floor around her, making it look plausible within the grim context of prison life and despair. He scanned the dusty floor, using his gloved hand to carefully wipe away any obvious signs of struggle, checking her hands and clothing, ensuring none of his own hair or uniform fibers remained. His movements were precise, almost robotic, his mind focused entirely on the task of concealment, shutting out the image of what he had done. He surveyed the room one last time, his flashlight beam sweeping over the silent equipment and the concrete floor, searching for any overlooked detail. Satisfied, he backed out of the room, gently pulling the heavy door shut until the lock clicked softly into place. He took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed his uniform, and wiped his sweating palms on his trousers, composing his features back into a mask of bored professionalism. He emerged from the old wing access, locking the door securely behind him, and melted back into the routine of his night shift patrol, his face impassive as he walked the sterile, familiar corridors, leaving the cold, final secret locked away in the darkness above. Tamara Jones's body was discovered the following morning. A maintenance worker, sent to investigate a faulty light fixture, reported near the old administration block, had noticed the door to the abandoned hospital wing slightly ajar. Perhaps David hadn't secured it as tightly as he thought in his haste, or perhaps the old lock hadn't fully engaged. Curiosity piqued by the unusual access to the restricted area, the worker pushed the door open and made the grim find amidst the dust and derelict equipment. The news spread through Redstone like wildfire, carried on currents of morbid curiosity and uneasy whispers. Yellow tape appeared, cordoning off the corridor leading to the old wing. Officials in suits, investigators from the state's Department of Corrections and county detectives, arrived, their serious demeanors and quiet efficiency casting a pall over the usual prison routine. Rumors proliferated among the inmates and staff alike. An accident, a desperate suicide by overdose, something more sinister involving another inmate, or even, whispered in hushed tones, a guard. The atmosphere grew thick with suspicion and hushed speculation, every sideways glance potentially loaded with meaning. David Miller moved through the ensuing chaos like a ghost, performing his duties with meticulous, almost exaggerated normalcy. He listened impassively as colleagues discussed the discovery in the break room or during shift changes, offering non-committal responses when asked for his opinion, feigning the same level of detached shock and mild concern expected of an officer uninvolved in the incident. He projected an air of professional detachment, a skill honed over 7 years of navigating the complex social and emotional landscape of prison work. When the investigators began their interviews, systematically questioning all staff who had been on duty the previous night. David maintained his composure. He recounted his patrol routine precisely, mentioning the fabricated minor issue, the supposed electrical fault check, that had drawn him near the abandoned wing's access stairs for a short time. He insisted firmly, his voice steady, that he had seen or heard nothing unusual. No sounds of distress, no unauthorized movement. His answers were concise, delivered in a level tone. His gaze was direct but carefully neutral, avoiding both excessive nervousness and unnatural calmness. Years of wearing the uniform, of mastering the art of emotional suppression demanded by the job, served him well now in this ultimate test. He built a wall of professional conduct around himself, brick by careful, deliberate brick. Inside, however, was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The lingering residue of the consuming rage that had driven him, the gnawing acid of newly blooming guilt that surprised him with its intensity, and the ever-present, suffocating fear of discovery. Every unexpected knock on his apartment door when he was off duty, every official-looking memo posted on the staff bulletin board, every time a supervisor summoned him for a routine matter, sent a jolt of panic through him, tightening his chest and making his palms sweat. The internal investigation proceeded predictably, hampered by the lack of clear evidence and the inherent difficulties of probing incidents within the closed, often secretive walls of a prison. In a place like Redstone, unexpected deaths, while tragic, were not entirely uncommon. Suicide rates were higher than in the general population, accidents happened in aging facilities, and underlying health issues could lead to sudden collapse. The initial assessment leaned towards accidental overdose or suicide, given the location and the scattered pill bottles found near the body, the ones David had planted. The abandoned hospital wing was officially deemed an unsafe, restricted area, reinforcing the narrative of an unfortunate accident resulting from an inmate wandering where she shouldn't have been, possibly seeking drugs or a place to end her life. Without clear evidence of foul play, no obvious signs of a struggle beyond what could be explained by a fall or seizure after taking pills, and lacking any witnesses, the investigators focused primarily on reviewing routine security protocols and identifying potential lapses that allowed an inmate access to the restricted area. David felt a sliver of fragile relief as the days passed. The focus seemed to be shifting away from homicide towards procedural failures. He allowed himself to believe, just for fleeting moments at a time, that he might actually get away with it, that the horrific secret would remain buried in the dusty, silent hospital wing. Then came the autopsy report. Official findings were usually kept confidential, circulated only among high-ranking officials and the investigators directly involved. But details inevitably leaked, filtering through the prison grapevine via clerks who handled the paperwork, medical staff who assisted the coroner, or guards privy to snippets of information discussed during internal briefings. David overheard fragments of conversation in the staff break room a few days after the initial discovery. Two officers were talking quietly near the coffee machine, one mentioning the preliminary coroner's findings discussed during a supervisor's meeting. The cause of death, the officer relayed, was confirmed as asphyxiation, consistent with strangulation, not overdose as initially suspected from the stage scene. This discrepancy raised eyebrows but wasn't conclusive proof of homicide without other corroborating evidence. Asphyxiation could, in rare cases, result from seizure complications or other medical events. The details were still murky, the investigation ongoing but seemingly losing momentum. But then came the unexpected detail. The piece of information dropped almost casually in the conversation. The fact that shattered David's carefully constructed facade of detachment from the inside out. Tamara Jones had been pregnant. Early stages, the coroner estimated, perhaps 8 to 10 weeks along. Pregnant. The word hit David with the force of a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. He stood frozen near the coffee machine, the cheap ceramic mug suddenly heavy, threatening to slip from his numb fingers. The casual, almost clinical tone of his colleagues discussing this finding, just another piece of data in a tragic case file, seemed obscene, unbearable. He turned away abruptly, mumbling an excuse about needing the restroom, needing desperately to escape the conversation. to process the catastrophic implication in solitude. He stared at his own reflection in the cracked mirror above the rust-stained sink, but the face looking back seemed like a stranger's. Pale, haunted, lines etched around eyes that held a new, deeper level of horror he hadn't known himself capable of experiencing. Pregnant. His child. The mathematical certainty was inescapable. The timing coincided perfectly with the period of their clandestine affair. The rage and consuming sense of betrayal that had fueled his murderous actions now seemed monstrously misplaced, disgustingly selfish, horrifically wrong on a scale he hadn't conceived. He hadn't just killed Tamara, the woman he had irrationally blamed for ruining his life with a diagnosis. He had extinguished the nascent life growing inside her, his own potential continuation, a life utterly innocent of any perceived wrongs. The weight of this realization was crushing, far heavier than the fear of legal consequences, which suddenly seemed almost secondary. It was a profound, soul-deep violation that stripped away any lingering shred of justification he might have desperately clung to in the dark recesses of his mind. The image of Tamara, no longer just the perceived source of his illness and betrayal, but as the carrier of his unborn child, overwhelmed him with a guilt so potent, so absolute, it threatened to suffocate him right there in the cold, echoing silence of the restroom. The official investigation eventually concluded, hampered by the lack of clear evidence, the absence of witnesses, and the inherent difficulties of probing incidents within the closed, often uncooperative walls of a maximum security prison. The conflicting detail of asphyxiation versus the staged overdose scene created lingering questions. But without concrete proof linking anyone to her death, the investigators were left with ambiguity. Tamara Jones's death was officially ruled undetermined, likely accidental overdose or suicide, resulting from an inmate gaining access to a restricted and unsafe area. The final report highlighted security protocol lapses regarding access to the abandoned hospital wing, recommending stricter controls and more frequent checks of disused areas. A few mid-level supervisors received formal reprimands for procedural oversights. The file was eventually closed, archived away in a records room. David Miller remained officially clear, untouched by suspicion beyond the routine questioning faced by all staff on duty that night. Life, or the prison version of it, moved on with its relentless, grinding rhythm. The yellow tape came down. The door to the old hospital wing was fitted with a new, more secure lock. Tamara's cell remained empty for a while, a small, stark void in the cell block, before eventually being cleaned out and assigned to a new inmate transferred from another facility. Her name faded from casual conversation among staff and inmates, just another tragic footnote in the bleak history of Redstone. David continued his job. He showed up for his shifts on time, walked the familiar corridors, checked locks, enforced the rules with the same outward diligence as before. Outwardly, he was unchanged. Officer Miller, part of the system, free, untouched by the slow gears of the justice system he represented. But the knowledge of what he had done became his true sentence, an invisible, inescapable prison constructed within the confines of his own mind. There were no steel bars, no scheduled counts, but the confinement was absolute. Every day became a torment. Passing the cell that had once been Tamara's, now occupied by someone else oblivious to its history, was a fresh stab of guilt, a visceral reminder that twisted in his gut. Seeing pregnant women during visiting hours, their rounded bellies a stark contrast to the harsh prison environment, triggered waves of nausea and a cold sweat. The image of Tamara, not as the perceived deceiver, but as the unknowing mother of his child, would flash in his mind, sharp and agonizing. The HIV diagnosis, the event that had initially consumed him with self-pity and blinding anger, now felt like a secondary punishment, a constant physical reminder residing within his own blood of the life he had taken in the other life, his own child's life, that he had destroyed before it even had a chance to begin. The irony was bitter. The disease he had feared and raged against now seemed a fitting, almost just, consequence, forever linking him physically to the tragedy he had wrought. The rage had burned out completely, leaving behind only cold ashes and the immense crushing weight of an unforgivable truth. There was no longer any twisted justification, no flicker of righteous anger to sustain him, only the stark reality of his actions. He had reacted to fear and perceived betrayal with ultimate violence, extinguishing not only the object of his fury, but also an innocent life connected inextricably to his own. He was condemned to live with the secret, buried deep inside, festering like the illness in his blood. He continued to walk the corridors of Redstone, a free man in uniform, but eternally imprisoned by the silent testament to the night vengeance turned into an unthinkable, irreversible tragedy, his conscience serving as both judge and jailer for the remainder of his days.